Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm doing a deep dive into practical behavioural science with three practitioners from across the globe who talk about some of the projects they've been working on in large organisations. My guests Heather Watson, Dan Bennett and Paolo Mercado all work for Ogilvy Consulting, a leading behavioural science practice. The idea behind the episode is to illustrate the breadth for which behavioural science can be put to use. So you'll hear about improving customer experience, protecting people who work in safety-critical industries by helping them to change their behaviour to be more compliant with safety protocols, and how behavioural science can improve sales of consumer products. We also explore some of the challenges of deploying behavioural science in larger organisations, the obstacles, both practical and political, and the fact that we can sometimes end up proposing counterintuitive or unorthodox solutions which work brilliantly, but can defy the logic by which normal corporate decisions are made. But then, that's the whole point of behavioural science. It allows us to come up with effective solutions to common problems that can't easily be solved by traditional thinking. The episode is also an opportunity for us to preview Nudgestock, Ogilvy's annual festival of behavioural science and creativity. This year it's taking place on June the 10th, and get some clues about what you can expect when you attend it. So with that said, please enjoy this deep dive into behavioural science in large organisations with Heather Watson, Dan Bennett and Paolo Mercado. Heather, Paolo and Dan, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Lovely to be here.
Yes, great to be here in your show. Thanks for inviting us.
Amazing to have all of you. And this is a behavioural experiment in itself, because I've never had three guests on the show. So what could possibly go wrong? Maybe to start us off, to avoid me causing human risk, let's go around and get you to introduce yourself. So Heather, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. I'm Heather Watson. I lead behavioral science in North America for Ogilvy Consulting. And my past life was as a behavioral designer at Dell Technologies. I actually convinced the leadership to start a behavioral design team. We designed customer journeys across the globe for millions of Dell customers in their services area. Also, we spun up a behavioral science team in their analytics department. So we were sprinkling behavioral design all over the Dell Technologies world. Amazing. And let's go in sort of reverse clock order. Dan, what's your story?
So my story, I've been the behavioural science practice as part of Ogilvy Consulting in the UK for 10 years. So we're 10 years old today. No, not today. I'm making that up. We're 10 years old this year. It's just more exciting to say it's today, isn't it? But we're 10 years old this year. And I've spent my career there, and I lead the UK team.
Fabulous. And Paolo?
So I consider myself a little bit like Ringo Starr, both the youngest and the oldest Beatle when he joined. So I just recently joined Ogilvy last year to be part of to help establish the behavioral science practice in Asia. However, I've been a practicing marketer and advertising guy for about 25 years now. I had spent 12 years on the client side, heading up marketing in the Philippines and in China for Nestle, as well as working for the head office of Nestle for one of their strategic business units. And I was also in advertising before that for a long time, worked at global head office roles, headed up a local market role in the Philippines. But at the core of where I started was really in the area of consumer insight and consumer behavior, because my background was in psychology. So coming to Ogilvy to do this role, it's like a little bit of a coming home. It's coming back to advertising after quite a long time on the client side, and also coming back to my roots in advertising, which is the application of psychology for consumer behavior. So yeah, it's been a exciting and adventure so far.
Amazing. And look, I think we will obviously come on before the show finishes to talk about Nudgestock, your global event. And this really illustrates that you are a global team. And you obviously, there's a similarity in what you do, but also some very unique projects. And what I thought we would do to sort of kickstart the conversation about the challenges of introducing behavioral science interventions into larger organizations is maybe go through with each of you and have an example of something you've worked on. So maybe we can start with you, Heather, and just sort of give us sort of one example of a project that you've worked on.
So with Dell Technologies, we were working on the customer journeys. And that's very interesting for a large organization to map a customer journey from a human point of view to look at all the gaps between the internal company silos. Because what you find with customer journeys and with customer experience in general is that the customer experiences the organization as the organization is, as they're designed. And so you find big gaps between, for example, when marketing stops and product experience starts, there's a huge gap there called the onboarding journey. That's actually one of the most important parts of a journey for a customer, especially with technology or a device adoption, because that's where you teach them how to use it. That's where you help them integrate that device into their lifestyle. But it's a huge corporate gap. And so when you start mapping the customer journeys, everyone in the organization can see where those gaps are. And then the leadership can decide to intervene at certain points in that journey where it's not very seamless and where your customers are falling in those gaps. And so that's what we started to do at Dell Technologies, especially in the services division, because that's the use part of the customer lifecycle. That's where you lose people. That's where people leave bad reviews. You really need to take care of your customers as they're using your product and your service. And then in this new world of recurring revenue and the subscription services, the use cycle is more important than ever because you need to keep people upping their subscription. So all this has started a new shift in really investing in that customer use part of the life cycle. And that's what I was doing at Dell. And so we were organizing 80 or 90 teams around a very long customer experience. And we were able to get everyone pulling in the same direction. So that's both an organizational feat and a behavioral science feat, because you were actually trying to change the customer experience by organizing all those people towards a common goal.
And so just if I put myself in the shoes of the customer, this is the kind of thing where you're speaking to one department and then for reasons you don't necessarily fully understand, there's a transition phase and it just doesn't feel seamless. In other words,
That's right.
It feels from a customer perspective like it's been organized around the company.
It is.
And in fact, what you want is the equivalent of, I always love talking about in hotels where it doesn't matter who you phone up. Some of them might even have, you press one button for whatever you need and they will sort all the stuff out behind the scenes and you can just worry, or you just report your thing and they'll sort it out. Whereas in less well-established organizations, you get this kind of, no, you need to speak to those people.
That's right.
And therefore we feel pushed around. And so that's when customers drop out. So if you can remove that, It becomes a more seamless process and you don't feel like you're being handed off. It just kind of flows effortlessly. That's the way to look at it, is it?
Yes. And I consider that the Trojan horse for behavioral science, right? Because it's something that all executives in every silo in an organization can understand, that their customer is dropping in the cracks between silos. And then when you make that visually into a customer journey, then you can start doing the real behavior science, which is how do we organize this organization internally? How do customers experience our product? Which parts of these behaviors are we going to try to change? And then you can organize teams around those specific points in the journey, because the journey is only as good as the worst part of it, right? Or the end, because we know peak end averaging, right? And no one pays attention to the end. Who pays attention to the end? Please, everyone out there, pay attention to the end of your customer experiences. It's one of the most important parts. It's what sticks in our memory more than anything else. So just focusing people on those key parts of the journey is kind of behavioral science underground. And that's
amazing.
What we did.
Cool. Okay. And let's move through the other two case studies that we've got, because I think this is going to be really helpful for a rich conversation. So Dan, let's continue in the order that we had before. Talk a little bit about some of the stuff you've done.
So one of the areas I thought we would speak about was our work in behavioural safety. It's an area that not many people would think that we do. So basically it's going into environments, often kind of factories or airports and that type of thing, and understanding how to design that environment to get people to naturally do more safer behaviour. So we had a really interesting case in 2014, so right far back, looking at how do you get factory workers to wash their hands when they go into a factory and then when they leave the factory. So I say factory, it was actually an abattoir. So you'd think it would be quite natural to want to, we were actually told it was going to be a chocolate factory when we went over there, but there was some kind of mistranslation and we ended up that we're actually going to the kill zone. But so you would think in an abattoir it'd be very natural to kind of wash your hands fully compliant. But as the data shows, there's often times when we don't kind of fulfill the full hand washing routine that's needed to be compliant. And over kind of decades, all the kind of standard things to try have been tried. They tried paying people more if they did wash their hands. They tried paying people less if they didn't wash their hands. They tried doing group interventions, individual interventions, the blue lights, all the things you can imagine to get people to wash their hands had been tried. So when we came to this quite sticky challenge, we actually managed to do some creative problem solving using behavioral science. And that was the idea of coming up with a hand stamp. and it was a hand stamp with a specially designed ink inside it, which was a sticky ink. And so basically you walked into the hand washing bay, your hand was stamped with this sticky ink. The stamp takes the same amount of time to wash off your hands as the time that you have to wash your hands to be legally compliant. So basically you walk into the bay, your hand is stamped, you have to wash it off. And we got some amazing results. Instances of dirty hands reduced by 63% overnight, even on the night shift, which is the shift where people tended to kind of just whiz through the hand washing bay and kind of do a performative clean. And so really it opened our minds to, it's not just about using behavioral science in communications and advertising and all those great things, and even designing experiences. It can be used to do some really important challenges that kind of the classical toolbox has failed to achieve.
It's really interesting, right? Because it's a great example of where logic, well, people would want to wash their hands, right? Because it's the right thing to do. It's healthy. It keeps them safe. And yet, prime example of human beings not doing the logical thing, even when they know it's the right thing to do. And you've basically gone, okay, so we have to play on a different level here. So it's a brilliant example of where we are our own worst enemies in many respects, ignoring rules that we understand. And so if we're doing that with things that we understand, you can imagine that there's lots of other cases where we might not understand or see the rationale for doing it.
There's a really interesting slight top-up story, which is we then went to work in another factory, and we were looking at the PPE, or the personal protective equipment that people watch. And interestingly, from a psychological point of view, there's a danger in making people feel safer, because sometimes that can kind of enable them to be a bit more riskier. So you might have heard kind of the stories about in Olympic boxing, they now box without the headgear because that's actually the safer way of doing it. You would think the more we can cram protective equipment on people, the safer they would be. But actually, it kind of encourages them to kind of punch harder in a sense. So it's quite counterintuitive. So what we've been working with lots of factories around the world is to redesign personal protective equipment in a way that might make people feel as vulnerable as they are with wearing the equipment. So one of the areas we've been looking at and testing, and we've got some great results on, is safety gloves. So safety gloves, they reduce accidents, they don't stop accidents. So what we've managed to do is paint on a picture of a hand onto the glove to remind the brain that the hand is still inside there. And we've tried lots of different types. We've tried kind of natural skin, we've tried a skeleton, we've tried, lots of different permutations. And we've actually found through some different testing that, crazy as it sounds, having a picture of a hand on a glove reminds the brain that the hand is inside the glove, and kind of allows us to kind of act in a much more sensible and safe way. So another example of kind of counterintuitive thinking that you wouldn't get to without behavioral science.
And I love that, because you're right. There's so many tendencies to hide things away. Let's make things invisible. Let's remove problems. And not think about actually that's going against the core instinct, which is we need to see the risk and we need to understand it. And so I love that. I love that line of thinking. That's absolutely fascinating. And then Paolo, what have you got for us?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I have a little story on essentially what really converted me to looking at behavioral science, especially on the insight part when it comes to marketing and consumer goods marketing. So that's been my longest career background. So if for people who've worked in consumer goods companies, and perhaps this is true for other companies as well, there is this comfort that we take in market research and market research jargon. And we tend to look at that as the lens of as the main and only lens of truth. So what do I mean? So we take a look at market share data coming mainly from Nielsen and retail panels, and we try to understand the dynamics of the market that way. So this is my aha moment. So it comes. It's a very small story with a pretty big impact. So this has to do with a product that Nestle has in the Philippines. It's called Nestea. It's also available in the US, but in a different format. In the US, you see Nestea in a bottle. You consume it in a bottle. In the Philippines, it's in powder format. So it's a powdered iced tea that you mix in a glass and you enjoy a cold glass of iced tea. So this story starts when the brand was in a period of no growth, as in like 3 years, nothing was working in terms of getting people to take more Nestea. It wasn't a market share problem. It was a dominant market leader. It was a category issue. People were just not taking more Nestea. And the brand teams tried, the typical rational innovation. Maybe we put something in terms of ingredients. Let's add vitamin C. or let's improve the flavor, etc. And nothing was growing demand for it. And it just so happened that I had on my team at that time, and I was working on the agency side, at this time. And then she was a trained anthropologist, our insight person. And then she said, you know what, why don't we do something different? If the problem is generating more demand, so let's take a look at people who consume a lot of Nestea versus households which consume a little Nestea. And let's try to figure out what's the difference between the two. But instead of interviews, we did in-home observation. So really spending the entire day observing how the two households are different, videotaping people, taking a lot of pictures, etc. And it came down to one very simple thing. The people who would consume a little Nestea were very faithful to the mixing instructions on the pack, which was open the Nestea pack, take 3 teaspoons of Nestea, put it in a glass, add ice, add water to taste, etc., and enjoy. So they were very faithful to everything we were saying on the pack, and they were very faithful to what we were showing in our advertising. The ones who were heavy consumers of Nestea were, let's say, the disobedient ones. They were the naughty ones. They didn't read the pack at all. They would cut open the entire bag and then put it in a large pitcher. And then they would put all the water and all of the ice, and then they would serve it not in one glass, but in 5 or 6 glasses, because they're serving the entire family. And that became a very clear pattern in all of the household observations that they were doing. And they said, okay, this is a different thing. So without doing any innovation on the product formulation, an entire marketing plan was done not only to communicate and encourage people to mix in pitchers, but we also produced a promotional pitcher. And then we started to make it a standard thing that if you're going to make any Nestea, you make it in 1 liter. And so the pouch was designed for 1 liter mixing, and then all of the communications and the usage occasion and everything that we were doing was always social occasion and big liter mixing. Within the first year, it was double-digit growth. That continued in the second year, and by the third year, we had doubled the business in terms of volume. But the second part of the story is that because the consumer behavior 3 years later had significantly shifted, that nobody was mixing by the glass anymore. Everyone was mixing by 1 liter pitchers. What it allowed Nestlé to do was actually to optimize the formula of the powder, to concentrate it. So that, it's a little technical, but essentially what it means is that you can deliver the same taste of 1 liter with much less grams. And if you're doing it with much less grams, it actually improves the profitability exponentially on the product. So that one little observational insight in home led not only to accelerated volume growth from years of no growth, but it also led to a path towards greater profitability. And for me, that was a big eye-opener that it made me push our marketing teams to not ignore Nielsen. That's important. You need to know where your market share is. You need to know what categories are moving, etc. But you also need to know, okay, but how are people actually using your product? And are they using it in the way you imagine them to, or are they using it in ways that perhaps could lead to unseen opportunities for growth? And for me, that's when I became really convinced and started to push that more internally within Nestlé, and now practicing it and encouraging other clients to, let's say, I would say drink the Kool-Aid, but adopt the behavioral science faith. If I were to put it that way.
And it's a really interesting theme, right? Of people using things in ways that you hadn't envisaged. Mm-hmm. And we design products, we design systems, processes with a particular objective in mind. And we know what we're doing. And I see this in the work that I do, for example, with compliance people, where they know exactly what the game is, right? They understand this thing in detail. But if you've got a once a year process, the same logic, you have to watch what people are doing and think about it from their perspective. And I think that's a lovely illustration of something where if you hadn't bothered to do that, if you just looked at things from the producer's perspective, you'd have one sort of set of solutions, watching what people actually do. And of course, the customer is always right. Mm-hmm. It's like, because they're the ones buying the product. Who are we to tell them? So I love that idea of going, let's in the nicest possible way, snoop and observe a little bit about what is this doing in the wild, and then what can we learn from that? And as you've rightly pointed out, suddenly the solution looks entirely different.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, as we pointed out, it is something we would never have guessed if we continued to look at the standard market research data that we had. Sometimes the response is, okay, we're trying to understand this from the retail audit data. We don't understand it. Let's do either of two things. Let's do some qualitative focus groups. We put all of these people in an aquarium and we talk to them. And then we don't really get it, because when we ask them, so what are you looking for in the drink? But, they'll tell us things that, okay, they'll talk about the vitamin C, they'll talk about the taste, etc. We innovate in that direction and it wasn't working. So it was only until we got out of that aquarium of focus groups and started to get into the house and not ask questions first. We wanted to watch first and then ask questions later, and that was really the key for that. And it led me also to really explore other things on the application of observation and observational insight, especially in not only consumption moments, but especially in shopping moments. Right now, of course, with a lot of shopping happening online, and there's a lot more data in terms of actual, I would say, forensic evidence of behavior that you can capture. So that's great, and that's there. But I do think there is still a need for some behavioral insights to explain, why is the data behaving this way? Why are people choosing it this way? So it's not just looking at the after effects of the choice, but perhaps even just watching how people make those choices, and then do post behavior interviews. I think those are still very valuable in this big data driven environment that we have right now.
And there's something really interesting. I mean, the way all three of you have talked about the projects, very different, and yet all driving at that one thing of the experience of the end user or customer and how we can see things from their perspective. And the thing I always find fascinating is that obviously the people that have designed the product, that have designed the existing solution or approach, they haven't just sort of done that on a whim. There's been some effort gone into it. And I think these are all fascinating examples of how conventional wisdom doesn't necessarily always deliver things, and we really need to get into the heads of the end user and really understand what is it like from their perspective. And that so there's a little bit of a behavioral challenge in terms of sort of we are challenging the way things are being done. By default, there will be some orthodoxy there that we need to overturn. And I wanted your collective thoughts on going about doing that, because that people may recognize the problem, but the solutions that you're all proposing do require us to say, have we thought about this in the right way?
There's a great example we had with Christian Aid, a UK charity. And it's all about kind of overcoming our own egos and kind of knowing, what we think is going to work. And so often testing is one of the clearest ways to kind of fight through a lot of these kind of pre-assumptions that we have. So with Christian Aid, a UK-based charity, they do a lot of their donations during their 1 week Christian Aid week. And on the Monday, some kind volunteers go out and they'll drop an envelope in your door. And the idea is that you kind of fill it up with change and notes throughout the week. And on Friday, some kind volunteer comes and picks it up and it all gets counted up. And then we see how much we've made. And for years, kind of that number had sadly been in decline. So we had the opportunity to test out different donation envelopes to different kind of random places around the country. And we had 6 different conditions and obviously a massive control, because we're talking about the United Kingdom, which is very helpful. And some of the ones that we thought were definitely going to work were the gift aid envelopes. So we would add in a notice to say that if for every kind of pound you put in, the government, if you just fill out a couple of these details, will also give in some free money. So you'll get to donate even more without even having to pay for it. Collectively, and we kind of work in an organization with lots of expertise in this area, and a lot of people would have backed that envelope. And yet one of the envelopes that performed the highest, in fact, the gift aid envelope reduced donations. Adding the gift aid and making the gift aid more salient reduced donations significantly. The one that increased donations significantly was the orientation of the envelope. So we're using the behavioral science principle of affordance cues, and we changed it from a landscape envelope to a portrait envelope, and it increased donations significantly, over 10%. And we think it's because it allows you, it feels a bit safer to put something into a deep area. It feels like that's the right thing to do. The other principle that worked incredibly well was costly signaling. So kind of we unconsciously infer that if it's a flimsy envelope, then it must be for putting small amounts of money, and no one cares about this campaign. If it's an expensive, thick envelope, then it must be for putting secure amounts of money and larger amounts of money. The slightly thicker envelope, again, drove donations by at least 10%, and people put higher amounts of money in those envelopes. And so at the start of the process, with all this expert judgment, the less rational ones to go for was the orientation of the envelope and the thickness of the envelope, especially because that costs more for a thicker envelope and it uses more paper and all that type of thing. But it'd be gift aid. So I think part of this is testing is what really can kind of cut through all of this difficulties with having lots of kind of opinions in the process.
Hi, it's Christian here. I'm just interrupting the show to say that if you're interested in hearing more about the application of behavioural science in the charity space, then do take a listen to a recent episode I recorded with Dan's Ogilvy colleague, Maddie Croucher. There's a link to that in the show notes. With that said, back to the episode.
But I would say there is significant organizational pushback on a test and learn culture, specifically because the people with the control, executives and VPs, like to get things done fast, number one. So there's a strong pressure on time in organizations, which means test and learn cycles can take a little bit of time. And number two, they just want to get on down the road and they think their expertise is going to solve it. And those things just, trickle down the organization. So you just look to the highly paid person to make the decision, and then you get on down the road. So test and learn is slower, and it requires a little less power in that executive level because the evidence makes the decision, not the executive. And that can be very unnerving, I think, when you are under a lot of pressure to make your quarterly, goals.
That's fascinating, right? Because I think what we're pointing towards here is upending conventional wisdom within the way companies think. So typically, the senior person has most experience and that's why they're in that position. Right. And I think it's really fascinating in a digital world and particularly where there are shifts in social trends, and we've seen it with, for example, working patterns, and we see it with things like Black Lives Matter and people's perceptions of what companies should be about and their involvement in social. A lot of things happening. And so I think it's interesting that people at the top of organizations who we've often look to the great and the good with it, they must know the answer to stuff because that's why they're in the senior position. Well, actually, maybe the past experience they've had is not much use in solving some of these things. So in a changing world, that's a challenge. But what you're also pointing at is saying, actually, we need to be trying some wacky stuff, some stuff that is the sorts of things that they won't have been trying on the way up because those things are risky and those experimental. So there's almost something in the way corporate decision-making is structured.
Absolutely.
That means you're not just battling the individual solution that they've come up with for the particular challenge they're facing, but you're also battling the very way that they think about
Absolutely.
things.
Yeah, it's basically the project. It's the problem of innovation in organizations in that innovation is not efficient. It requires a lot of testing. What the heck is going to work here? We have to make a lot of small bets. And that's not the way you run an efficient organization, because most organizations are run the business, and innovation and behavioral science is change the business, which is innovation. And so there's always a struggle between how many people you put to each of these, how much you invest. Do you disrupt your current operations to try all these new things? So from an organizational standpoint, it's a conundrum.
And I'm also fascinated by, Dan, you talked a little bit about things that your presumptions about what would work. So there's something really interesting is how behavioral scientists get their ideas, because we've got constrained thinking within organizations where, it's almost like we need somebody external to come in to help us think about this stuff, right? Because if we propose these crazy ideas internally, that's risky. Let's get someone in that really knows their stuff. But even as you were pointing out, Dan, there's an interesting challenge for those of us working in the behavioral science space. So how do we broaden our minds sufficiently to make sure that we've captured all these ideas? Because we come with our own biases and preconceptions.
Yep. If I may add, let's say, another layer of complexity to this one, or challenge to this, because I did come from an organization that would say and would claim, and to a certain extent it was very true, that it had a test and learn culture. But the test and learn culture is defined, or we become slaves to particular tests. And so let me start with the one that is the bane of the industry, which is ad testing. So in the previous organization that I worked for, we tested everything to death. So to make sure that we had all of the responses right in terms of consumer memorability, likability, etc., and purchase intent. And even when we did that, okay, it would work, but nothing was ever really stellar. And then you would get conflicting things in the organization. Sometimes people would say, no, don't test, trust your gut on this one. So the people would say that, and it's true. But then if you're a marketer and it's your brand and you have bosses, and then if you did something risky and it didn't work, and they said, did you test it? And said, no, we went with our gut. And then you'd really get, what for. So nobody blames you for launching an ad that tested well and it didn't work. Nobody says the test is crap, and nobody blames you because you did the right thing of actually testing before launching. So what happens is then we optimize all of our insights to pass the test. We don't optimize it in order to make an impact with consumers in terms of actual end result behavior. We use the proxies of ad testing, and I would also argue very much you have the same problem not only with advertising, you have the same problem with innovation concept testing. And I make a difference between innovation concept testing versus prototype test and learn development, which is really where the true innovation or the true innovators believe in the prototype testing. But many of the bigger CPG companies, they don't, about prototype. No, I mean, this is about concept. You believe in the product concept, and we put a lot of trust in product concept testing. And again, the same thing. And it launches, it fails, and there are many stories of failures. We never really look at maybe the problem's the test, versus, because you're testing ideas, you're testing how people understand it. You're not testing behavior. And I think that's a major thing that we also need to consider on this. It's not just adopting a test and learn culture, but really reviewing, are we testing behavior? The behavioral impact of our advertising, or the behavior and how people will use our innovation.
How do you get your ideas? So, all of you've talked about, so this is what we came to do. And I guess when you're observing people, things will occur to you. But if I take, for example, your safety examples, Dan, the idea of kind of, well, let's expose what's behind the glove, right? It requires a sort of, you're flipping the world on its head, because normally we hide these things away. And so there's some behavioral science support. What are the processes that you go through to kind of brainstorm, for want of a better phrase, the approaches you might adopt?
This is the key part, really. I mean, we talk about bringing behavioral science, creativity, and data science together. And they don't sound like very friendly companions to each other, do they? Behavioral science sounds like the opposite. It sounds like a very bad best friend to creativity, but it turns out it can be quite a good best friend if you use it correctly. So we use behavioral science to kind of open up the solution space. We use behavioral science to help creatives and ourselves to think even broader than they normally would. And so I know you had Sam on a couple of weeks ago who talked about this process really well, but it's really about really defining the problem in terms of its behavioral objectives. A lot of people know about their business objectives. They don't know what the behaviors are that they need to change. Then it's about making sure that we're truly diagnosing that behavior with a psychological lens. So we're not just on the lookout for all the rational reasons why someone would do something and all the kind of the given reasons. We're looking for that level deeper to understand what else is at play in kind of the deeper parts of the brain. Once we have that defined, then we're ready for creativity. Then we're ready for really thinking about it differently. And that process tends to be about looking at the different behavioral principles that we can look at and using them as springboards to kind of opening up new lines of thinking, new investigations. So I think our industry is closest towards kind of Poirot and kind of, detective murders. It's kind of really opening up as many lines of inquiry as we can. It's a very expansive process. So we might have, going into a workshop, we might use kind of, upwards of 20 principles, and then upwards of kind of, 100, 200 provocation statements based on those principles to get us to so many. And then we kind of see where the magic comes out. There's a lot of waste in, as Heather was saying, there's a lot of waste in creativity. So we only need 2 or 3 of those sparks to be right, which we can then kind of blow out again in their own process. And so it's kind of, it's methodical, it's forensic, but still it relies on making sure we've really defined that problem very, very tightly. If we haven't defined the problem tightly, we would just have a very general ideation off the back of it.
Well, and also we're very rigorous about defining the behavioral barriers. So once you have defined the behavior that drives whatever business priority you're looking to drive, that one behavior, and that's actually hard enough to do, then we are very rigorous on defining the barriers to that behavior. And that's when the creativity starts unlocking. So a lot of the times the barriers are contextual, they're environmental. And so that gives you other places to look, as in the factory and as in the NST example. A lot of times the barriers are attention or habit. And so we're always looking at those kind of, the big ones, habit, attention, and environment, and figuring out how that behavior maybe can be modified a little bit given those big variables that drive behavior.
And I love that positive view of people, right? Because very often a traditional approach would go, oh, people aren't doing what we want. So maybe that silly consumers don't understand this thing. We must educate them about how they should do it. Yeah. Or in the health and safety context, this is what you need to, you will wash your hands because that's a requirement, right? And we'd tell you what to. And there's a sort of implicit presumption that we're dealing with idiots, right? Who just, as if only we could tell them the right way to do things in the right way, it would land. And that fails to recognize exactly what you've outlined, Heather, which is actually there are damn good reasons. We might not agree with them, but there will always be some kind of good reason why the behavior that's on display is on display. And if we can start to understand that, we can play with that, as opposed to this sort of fantasy land of, I am going to convert these people to my way, it's my way or the highway. And that sounds really simple. And yet that's sort of often what is missing from these traditional solution sets that behavioral science allows you to start playing with.
Absolutely. And I'll build on that one. And I think the key point to what you're saying, that when people aren't behaving in the way we want them to, first of all, when most brands or most institutions try to initiate a behavior change, it's always education and attitude. Let's work on education or let's work on attitude. Either they don't know how to do it or they're not motivated. So let's just win them emotionally on our side. So both can be very powerful. But I think the first point is sometimes the reason is not an articulated or a rational reason. It may just be a contextual circumstance. They can't do it. They don't have the capability of performing the action that you want. So, for example, I live in a city where littering is a problem, and then there are no littering signs everywhere. But the one thing that the city doesn't have is trash cans. Obviously, something's gonna. Somebody will need to put their trash somewhere, and we have a culture where cleanliness is, let's say, like a very, very small circle around you. So literally 1 meter around you is what you keep clean. So you can keep your car clean, but if there's any trash inside the car, my car is not clean. I need to keep my car clean, so I throw it out. But because it's outside my 1 meter of responsibility, I don't care. So the key thing is that how do you get people to understand, okay, that meter of responsibility needs to expand. But more than that, how do you enable people to actually throw the trash in the right place, beyond just advising them don't litter, etc. So yeah, it's going beyond reason and looking at things like capability and the opportunity also to actually perform the behavior.
The other thing that struck me, Dan, you used the C word, creativity, which I absolutely love. Partly I love it because it gives us permission to spend time, listening to people like John Cleese and sort of doing fun things, right? So let's not pretend this is a tough thing to bring into play, because it's great fun. But I think it's amazing because it's something that we're innately born with. If you look at kids, give them some toys and they'll do incredible. Lego is a great example of kids can do amazing things that weren't intended, but produce sometimes awful, appalling outcomes for some of them. So it's naturally built in with us. And I love the fact that this discipline suddenly authorizes us to go down that route. And it authorizes us to use comedy, and it authorizes us to use play on emotions. So there's a whole load of things there that are innate to us as humans. but we're not really permitted to do that. And so this is the gateway drug, if you like, that says, okay, we now have a cover story that allows us to think about these things and to think in wild and wacky ways, in a way that as Rory often says, right, you would get thrown out of the boardroom for making some of these suggestions without that behavioral science permission, if you like, to have those conversations.
I mean, once you have the behavioral science language, one of the best things that behavioral science offers is kind of a codification and a common way about talking about persuasion strategies. Once you have that language, you're not just stuck to looking for inspiration about how to do something by looking at what your immediate competitors are doing, which is what everyone is so zoned in on, kind of what are the other four players in my area doing.
Right. It's like best practice always kills me, because it's like, what are you looking at, right? Other people who may not have come up with the best solution.
Yeah, they're not going to magically have anything else. We want to do discovered practice, not best practice. And so what behavioral science is allowing us to do is to kind of look at lateral categories. We were working on looking at making it easier to buy adult diapers. So there's a lot of good reasons why a lot of people should be buying adult diapers, but it's incredibly stigmatized category. A lot of the times because of the language that is used on the pack and kind of within the industry. So one of the things we were looking at here is, there's a difference between calling it bladder strength and bladder weakness, right? They're two very different things. One is a positive frame, one's a negative frame. It's very interesting. In the US, there's one version. In the UK, there's another version. The stigma is going to vary slightly. We were looking at as far out categories as Scientology. How do Scientologists recruit other Scientologists, given it's a lot, can be a stigmatized religion? And I'm looking at the strategies that they would use in their kind of acquisition journey to overcome that. We can borrow less. Once we have the language of behavioral science, we can borrow lessons from when someone else has overcome that psychological challenge into how we get people to feel more comfortable buying adult diapers. That's the magic of this whole discipline, really.
And I love there's something quite inspiring about it as well, because it is back to the conversation we've had about it challenging orthodoxy and sort of giving people fresh. And we all know that we get bored of things. And so I loved your comment, Dan, about allowing the language allows it, because if I look at the language of economics, that allows us to get into numbers, right? If I look at the language of behavioral science, that allows us to get into fun. I know which side of the fence I want.
It's very interesting, because the more we know about people and the more we really know about people rather than just their demographics, the better we can influence them. So one of the real kind of limiting kind of structures we have within marketing is this obsession with targeting people and talking about people according to their demographics and their behavioral data, the things that they do, and whether they're a woman or a man or whatever, as if that can be kind of inspirational to the creative process and ultimately persuading someone to do something. So if you think about, you might have seen this online, Prince Charles and Ozzy Osbourne. If we looked at their demographics only, they're both male. They're both born in 1948. They're both raised in the UK, both married twice, both live in a castle, both wealthy and famous. According to their demographic data, they are very similar people. But we know that Prince Charles and Ozzy Osbourne aren't the same person. If we were to look at their personality profiles, if we were to look at their worldviews, if we were to look at their thinking styles, we'd notice they're very different people. So one of the our latest tools is looking at all of those types of kind of cognitive profile information. So, and it's much more effective, because if we know that someone or a certain segment is extroverted, there's data to suggest, and we can kind of test this to confirm, but they're more persuaded by social proof, because extroverts love hearing and love to doing what other people are doing. If we know that that segment is more introverted, we know that they may respond better to loss aversion and pointing out what they stand to lose rather than what they stand to gain. So one of the big conundrums we think kind of over the past 10 years is for behavioral scientists is knowing which principles to use with which person in which area. We know that the principles are interesting. We know that they exist in certain areas. We just don't know on kind of the equalizing mixing desk which one's active when. And so hopefully by knowing more about you and beyond your demographics, knowing more about people's kind of cognitive profiles, we're able to better recommend how to target someone. And that leads to much more fun conversations than just going, how do we target millennial women?
Right, because we've all had that where you get targeted by something. I always find it quite a relief when I go onto Amazon or Facebook and I get fed something that is so patently out of kilter with what my interests are. I don't want to buy another trampoline. Thank you very much. I just bought one, right? And I haven't, but you get the point. But you just look at that, you go, that's so irritating. So on the one hand, I'm relieved it means the tech's not that great, right? Because they're feeding me with absolute nonsense. On the other hand, it's illustrative of the point, which is really annoying. How dare you try and characterize me as this? So those crass attempts actually have a backfire effect in many cases, because I'm really irritated. How dare you think of me like that? And so I like this idea of engaging. And of course, the digital environment, and I come back to my Amazon trampoline example, in theory, gives us much more ability to do that.
I think 2 trampolines sounds quite fun, Christian, personally, but
sadly, Dan, and I suspect, like you, that I don't live in an Ozzy Osbourne castle that's but we can aspire, right? And so I wondered, as all of you sort of reflect on the work that you're doing. I mean, one of the things I think is great about the discipline is that we're always constantly learning. And it's, I won't quite go as far as saying there is never a dull day, because that's always tempting fate. But there's a really interesting process. And I wonder about your observations on what you've learned in terms of engaging. Because one of the things that when we look at cross context, Dan, the examples that you gave are really, really interesting ones, where you're looking at a completely different category, something that you wouldn't necessarily link. So by default, the range of sources and inspirations and ideas is constantly changing, and you're having to look in new places and different places and kind of challenge your brain. I wondered how you feel that that's helping you evolve your own sort of processes and thoughts, because it does strike me it is genuinely a career where one is constantly learning new things.
I'm always, as I work in this field, I am more and more humbled by what we think we know and what we try and what actually works. And so if you're someone who has a low ego, you can work in this field because you realize that you're not going to be right, even with the 100 years of research behind each of these deep disciplines, right? Psychology, cultural anthropology, neuroscience, which is, advancing at an incredible rate. Like all these academic disciplines, we look at what we know, we test things in lateral categories, and we sometimes make it and we sometimes don't make a difference. And that keeps you very humble. So my approach to problem solving probably hasn't changed that much. We're gonna look at everything. We're gonna use we have very clear methodologies and rubrics that we use to diagnose things. But we still don't know exactly what's going to work in the end. And so it just keeps you humble. And, when you're trying to change your own behavior or even of the behavior of people you love, you realize it's a lot harder. And when people ask you big questions like, can you change beliefs? You're like, actually, no, I can barely change my kids' behavior, but we'll give this a try.
We'll give it a shot. I mean, one of the things I've been reflecting on, especially over the past couple of years, is the need to really engage multiple stakeholders. A behavior change often isn't just getting one person to do one thing. It's when you say you work in B2C, business to consumer, you're actually working in B to B to B to C to C to C. It's not actually a very linear line. We were doing a really interesting project in a call center. Call centers are obviously great places for testing out behavioral science, because you can have different teams of people using different principles and then seeing which one works and which ones don't work. And we were working with Adobe in India, and we were looking at how do we get people, so when customers are ringing up to cancel their Creative Cloud subscription, what can we get the agents to say that would retain them for a little bit longer? And what they used to say was, why are you looking to cancel today? And from a marketing point of view, that's a great thing to say, because you're going to understand all the reasons why people are leaving, and you can kind of sort those up further upstream. From a psychological perspective, it's terrible, because you're getting people to mentally rehearse all the reasons why they want to leave. It makes it impossible for the agent to ring you around in the next 5 minutes. So one of the conditions that we, no magic bullets, we tested many conditions. One of the conditions that we tested was kind of a priming idea of getting people to ask the customers who wanted to leave why they wanted to join the Creative Cloud subscription in the first place, understand their original intentions and goals, so we could then have a conversation about how we get you to achieve those, rather than how I rescue you with some kind of monetary incentive. And that worked. That got over an 8% increase in retention rates, which is worth millions of pounds and millions of dollars every year. However, even once we'd done that test, we'd done the measurement, we'd have onboarded a load of the agents, and everyone was on board, getting people to actually say it on the call going forwards was really hard, because the system that they were using whilst on the phone to the customer, a top drop down box, was still enter the reason why the customer's looking to cancel. So given how much is going on here, the fight between system 1 and system 2, while you're on a phone call, operating a computer system, trying to save a customer, trying to remember your training, all that's going on, people tend to just default to answering the questions on the screen in front of them. So until we changed that drop-down box on the agent's computer to say, enter reason why they were looking to join in the first place, it wasn't said. Even though each individual agent had the data to say that they would get more personal incentive because they would be saving more people, that wasn't enough to get them to change their behavior. So I'm understanding that the more that we do, the more that we really have to understand a system rather than just understanding how to change a behavior, if that makes sense.
And I find that fascinating because actually somebody's put the drop down there in the first place.
Which is not the marketing and retention department. It's the product development department. Hence, we have to go back to this customer journey so everyone can see how they feed into these behaviors and then create their own goals to achieve them. Otherwise, you have the organization doing all kinds of things. And even when you find the solution, you can't implement it in a broad and scalable way. And so scale is one of those things that we're all struggling with. I think everyone is struggling with. How do you scale the behavior change?
Right, which points to the challenge of, I mean, you're talking about really big organizations that you work with here. And so there's if you can get this right, there is obviously a huge benefit because it's being done on a massive scale. But as you've both pointed out, the challenges with that is it's not just simply turn up and tell one person how to do their job slightly differently, job done. There are lots of inputs to these processes and lots of vested interests. And I don't necessarily mean that people are actively trying to obstruct, but maybe there is some reason why what you're proposing might be a threat, it might be too difficult, they may not fully appreciate it. So you're having to win a lot of people over. I wondered about your thoughts on convincing people, because we're all convinced by behavioral science, we get it, but I'm really conscious, right, that we live that stuff. We understand it, we've seen the power of it somewhere else. When I've got somebody with their own little universe that may not understand the implications of what that they're having on a wider scale, how do you start to manage some of those things? Because clearly someone's brought you in, so they're convinced by that piece, right? So you can sell to wherever it is, but actually you need the organization to pull with you, because humans, as we know, are tremendously capable of being obstructive, pains in the backside, slowing things down or getting in the way, sometimes without even realizing it. How do you manage that?
That's a tough question. I was still on the last question actually, because and maybe I'll get to that once, because I had two. Let's say, I mean, coming into a behavioral science role and coming back to my roots, in terms of where I started in advertising, it actually struck. I gave a talk once, a very provocative one, to the Advertising Association in the Philippines, and I was a client at that time, and I said, you know what the problem with the ad industry is that you have an identity crisis. And your identity crisis is that you call yourself the creative agencies. And the problem with that is, I was saying, I'm not saying that you're not creative. What I'm saying is that you're not the only creative act in town. Digital can be creative, media can be creative, television is creative, you name it. There's a whole list of industries that are formally called creative industries. So if you're part of creative industries and you call yourself a creative agency, that's like it's like an oxymoron. It's redundant. So what are you? What do you do? So the whole point of my provocation to the ad industry at that time was that embrace who you are. Be like Tyrion Lannister. Because there was this conscious effort of the advertising agencies to not call themselves advertising. Oh, we're creative agency. We're not advertising. We're creative agencies. But I kept telling them, wear it like armor. Because at the root of the word advertising is to turn, to convert, to persuade people. And for me, that's what I love about being in behavioral science. It's getting back to the core of what advertising is supposed to do. Perhaps beyond the lens of just communication, beyond that one-trick pony of the 30-second TVC. That for sure, you need to move away from the one-trick pony of the 30-second TVC or the print ad or the big idea campaign. And you have now a lot of other tools to be able to persuade and move people. So for me, I think we hesitated at the question because there are a lot of ways that you could be doing to move people and to persuade them. And I think that's the beauty of the practice. You could do so many things now. You're not limited to that 30-second or the Super Bowl ad or that viral Facebook campaign. You could do it from an environmental point of view. You could persuade people from a design point of view, even from a symbolic point of view of how do you redesign your brand. And so it really opens up the avenues of persuasion. But at the core of it is that we need to see ourselves. We're behavioral science. We apply behavioral science. We are not behavioral scientists. Those are the academics, the PhDs, and they do a great job. But what we need to be doing is to take that application and really produce something that is effective in terms of moving people either towards a brand behavior or even a safety behavior, or let's say overcoming unconscious bias. But we now have all of these tools at our disposal to affect that change. So I went a long way around to get to answering the question.
That was great. One of the things that I find really, really interesting about the sort of practitioner space is that you've got some people who, frankly, aren't very good at communicating with human beings, right? Who sort of play in the behavioral science space, and they're very good at telling you which particular bias or heuristic is in play here. And it's kind of, I almost feel like sometimes they would be just as happy sort of programming algorithms as they would trying to program people. And I think one of the things that's fascinating about you and the people that I really respect in the industry is that there's clearly an ability to communicate to humans, right? So this is people that get other people working on human solutions. And I sometimes worry that we get sort of paint by numbers behavioral science, which is let's get out our cognitive checklist and we'll go through all those biases and we'll work out which one. That's a very sort of logical approach. And this, as you've all been pointing out, is a very soft, skilled, emotional, and not necessarily logical. And we need to work through these things and be very human about how we approach it.
I certainly think, there's certainly a role for, Oliver Payne used this phrase a while ago. He said there's a certain amount of behavioral tidying up in the world to be done. There's a load of letters out there, a load of text messages. They just need people to kind of put principles on and optimize a bit and get those percentage conversions and happy days. A lot of efficiency work to be done. But behavioral science, we often say, is the missing seat at the table. It shouldn't be the only seat at the table, definitely not. But it is often the missing seat at the table. And what we really advocate for is there are interesting and important problems out there that would make the world a better place, whether it for profit, for planet, for people. And it's really important that we use behavioral science to be that missing seat at the table, to bring our expertise there. So another example of, we did some work with Gatwick Airport. Amazing place to do behavioral science, understanding how we get people, when you go through security, to pack your little liquids in the bag correctly. People get it a bit wrong. They forget that creams are actually liquids. Some people are in denial and some people are just trying to get away with it without knowing, because at Heathrow, you kind of get away with a few things. But at Gatwick, it's super strict. Top tip if you're in London. But what's super important about that is for at least 10 years, since 2001, when the liquid rules were introduced, many efforts had been made to try, of the classic toolbox, to get people to have a compliant liquid bag so they can spend more time in duty free, they can have a better airport experience, and so on and so forth. But it hadn't been cracked. And so we really believe that there's a load of problems out there that the classic toolbox has had a go at and it hasn't managed to solve. And these stickier challenges, that actually this is where we can bring a creative approach to behavioral science to help solve. And that genuinely, hopefully, humbly, is adding value to the world in a way that, it's doing something that no other discipline can. And that's what's so exciting about the whole space.
But I love about that, if we can stop pissing people off by putting in place stupid bureaucratic process that we all know that we all don't need in our lives, then that's a wonderful thing, right? That is a wonderful gift to the world. Speaking of wonderful gift to the world, I can't let you all go without talking about the premier behavioral science event of the year, which is Nudgestock. So I don't mind whichever one you wants to go for it, but just tell us, for people that haven't come across it, they've been living under a rock, what is Nudgestock and what can they expect?
If you haven't seen it so far, wherever you've been. But no, we're very lucky. So we started Nudgestock in 2013 to be, the world's biggest festival of behavioral science and creativity, celebrating all of the kind of the practical work and great theory that can help solve some of these sticky challenges, to really kind of make a space for it. And it's going to be 10 years old this year. It's on the 10th of June, and it's going to be 10 hours long. So we're making it pretty cognitively easy for people to remember where it is and when it is. It's since the pandemic. I mean, we used to do it in an English seaside town to 500 people, and since the pandemic, we've managed to do it to kind of tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people. So it's really kind of taken off as a virtual event, a broadcast event. So it's going to stay like that this year again. We're really happy to say, and we've got some amazing people coming up. We can't reveal the whole lineup yet, but expect to see Maya Shankar, who used to be the behavioral science lead at the White House and is now the behavioral science lead at Google. We've got Dan Pink talking about his latest book, and we've got so many more. So we're talking about some of the big topics. One of the exciting pieces of content we're going to have is a panel on electric vehicles, but instead of it being a panel, we're actually going to do it inside of Rory's electric vehicle that he owns, and we're going to film the panel as he drives around London and the UK countryside. So it promises to be a great 10-hour broadcast event. Some people do watch the whole thing, but you will be able to kind of look at the agenda near the time to kind of slot in some key bits. So that's 10 hours long, 10th of June, nudgestock.com.
Brilliant, behaviourally brilliant. And I think the thing I love about it is it's an incredibly human event, right? So things do, as we saw last year, go wrong. And then it's highly entertaining to watch how you get your ways out of things. And there's something marvelous about getting a sort of bunch of psychologists and behavioral science people to put on a TV show. Genius thing, beautifully done. So I highly recommend. I will be glued to my sofa that day and enjoying it on the big screen for fun, because it is worthwhile. And I do want to say on behalf of all of us, thank you for putting on a brilliant, brilliant show. I will say, I do miss my trips to the seaside, because that was a great example of taking me somewhere I would not ordinarily have gone. But I recognize from a diversity and audience perspective, there is a benefit to making a virtual event. So thank you for that. And above all, thank you so much for coming onto the show and giving us some really interesting insights from across the globe, from a series of different contexts that I think illustrate how incredible behavioral science is, what fun it is to be involved with it, and the broad range of challenges that we're facing. So Heather, Dan, and Paolo, thank you so much for all the things you've come and explained, and for being amazing guests on the show.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to my three guests, Heather Watson, Dan Bennett, and Paolo Mercado. To find out more about Nudgestock, the Ogilvy Festival of Behavioural Science and Creativity that's on June the 10th. The tickets are free, by the way. Have a look in the show notes. There are links to that there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To be notified whenever a new episode in the series appears, do subscribe to the Human Risk Podcast newsletter. There's a link to that in the show notes as well. To find out more about human risk and the work that I do with my clients helping bring behavioural science to ethics and compliance, visit human-risk.com. I will be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe, think counterintuitively, and thanks for listening.